welcome everybody. The recording has started. Thank you all for coming. Today, Fábio and myself will tell you a little bit about the Society's financial position, our strategy, and our future outlook. And let me begin by sharing my screen, and I'm doing it slowly because there are people still coming in, and I don't see a point in starting too soon. So maybe I'll give 1 minute past, so I'll give it another minute before I start. As you can see from the opening slide, I hope you can see it all. I'm the chair of the governing board this year, and Fábio, whom you can also see in this meeting, he's our treasurer. And we've teamed up to tell you a little bit about our strategies, our financial situation, where we're coming from and where we're going. And so let me start out with my presentation, which is simply for context setting mainly. I'm only going to take about 7 or 10 minutes before I hand over to Fábio, who's going to give you a far more detailed exploration of our financial situation and where we're going. And I hope that we will then have plenty of time for Q&A at the end, because the whole point of this meeting is to get the membership involved in understanding what the board is doing when it comes to strategic and financial issues. So to place this into context, the Psychonomic Society is a very simple society. All it has to do is 2 things. Number 1, run an annual meeting, and number 2, publish our journals. That is our main mission, and this is what we've been doing for 60-odd years. Now, of course, it isn't quite as simple as that, because to make all this happen requires quite a bit of strategizing, and it requires a lot of money. Our annual meeting, just to give you a sense, costs around $1 million to organize every year. So where is this money coming from? Well, we're in a very fortunate position as a society, because we do have a reliable source of income, and that is our contract with Springer Nature and the royalty payments we receive from them as part of that contract for our journals. And just so you know roughly where we're sitting with this, we currently are about halfway almost through a 10-year contract with Springer Nature that expires at the end of 2030. And between now and then, we will receive annual royalty payments of, at the moment, around $1.9 million. That goes up by 3% annually, and is also subject to bonuses under certain circumstances. But we can skip over the details now. The ballpark figure is what you see here. This is how the society is financing its activities. Now, that is good news. It puts us on a solid footing, at least at first glance. But the publishing industry is undergoing major changes as we speak. Everybody knows that. Everybody is talking about it. So we don't know necessarily what's going to happen at the end of 2030. So what are we going to do? Well, the board's response, the previous board, their response has been to create an endowment. And we decided on this in November 2017 by adopting a charter, an endowment fund charter that is binding to all future boards and cannot be changed except under exceptional circumstances and with a 3/4 majority of the board. Now, what the charter is telling us is that we must have a minimum balance in the endowment of $8 million. And the use of either that principal or investment income from it is basically restricted to the core missions of the society. That is, we can only spend the money ever on meetings and journals, not other things that are, you know, general operating expenses. And the intention here is to use that endowment to insulate the society from outside economic challenges and whatever else might change in the environment, such as our publication contract, for example. And the idea is to grow the endowment to the point where the interest alone would enable us to proceed as a society ad infinitum without being reliant on one particular publisher or some other source of income. And Fábio will be providing a very detailed analysis and some modeling, some very fascinating modeling of how we can achieve that and what it would mean. Now, that's all kind of good news, and I'm very pleased and proud of all the boards that, you know, over the years have done this, and that we, myself as board member, have also been able to continue to do, because I think we're in a good shape. However, there are challenges, and let me just tell you what some of the challenges are, because they're kind of mind-boggling, at least to me. And that is the increase in cost. You can't even call this inflation anymore. Whatever this is, it's not inflation. It is beyond that. And this is being recorded, so I'm not going to label this necessarily with what I really feel about it. But basically, in the hospitality industry, everything has gone up, skyrocketed dramatically. Our cost of AV, just to give you one indicator here, has more than doubled. We used to pay between $100,000 and $150,000 a year for the meeting to have AV support. In 2023, that was $311,000. It has more than doubled pre to post pandemic. That is true for all other expenses in the hospitality industry as well. For example, food expenses have increased an average of 30%. If you want to know more about these increases, Lou Jamet, our executive director, is on this call, and he can handle some of these specific questions. So in response to that, what the board has done last year, as you all know, is to introduce registration fees for the annual meeting from 2024 onward. So not just this year, but all future years. Now, because we're in a very lucky position with our journals and the endowment, we've been able to keep our fees quite low, around half of the cost being charged by, for example, APS. And the other societies, our sister societies, probably charge more than double in many cases, like Vision Sciences and all that. They're talking about figures that make me very worried. But you know, they have to do it, and we have to do this. However, we hope, we expect to be able to keep the fees stable for at least several years from here on, because our modeling was conservative and was trying to avoid any future registration fee hikes. And just in case you're worried about the registration fees and their impact, as we were, the New York meeting this fall is the biggest we've ever had. And, you know, hotels are sold out and people are paying the registration fees. And this does not appear to have impacted the welfare of our meeting or of the society. And if you want to know more about the details underlying the decision about the registration fees and the forthcoming dues increase, which is next year, we've already foreshadowed that. We're committed to that. That QR code will direct you to the letter that you will have received earlier this year as a member of the society. Okay, and that's enough context setting. I will now hand it over to Fábio to present you with the modeling that is underlying this, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So thank you for your attention. Over to you, Fábio.
Thanks, Steve. I will get to my slides and share that screen, and then make a disclaimer that I'll leave a lot of the modeling under the hood in the presentation in these slides, just so I can go through these slides relatively quickly and give time for questions and answers in the end. So I'll talk more about the structure in the modeling, and I'll refer to some of the expectations that we have vis-a-vis the modeling, the projection, and that includes the registration fees and whatnot. So in case the membership ever wondered how does the society manage its funds, so I tried to give a an overview of how we do it, and it is in a simple manner. We have a checking account for day-to-day expenses. It is managed by our executive director, Lucia Matt, who's in the call, and used by the management company to actually get cut the checks and transfer money and whatnot. It is monitored by the treasurer. I am in that capacity at the moment to maintain sufficient balance. And that's part actually of the first piece of modeling that is under the hood is when we started the position of treasurer as is now, one of the initiatives was to model how we had spent money over the course of the year and make sure that we have sufficient balance in that account for at least 3 months of the projected expense, which varies from month to month in the year. As you might imagine, for example, it's particularly high closer to the meeting because of the prepaid expenses that we have to do with. It also has two peaks around the times that we get stipends for our editors and associate editors, for example, in the journals. So we have that in place, and then we have investment accounts that's also managed by our executive director. It is monitored very closely by me, and the idea here is to keep balances in alignment with what the finance committee has advised the governing board to do and what the governing board has agreed and directed us to do. We follow a recommendation to keep a target balance in those accounts of about 6 to 12 months of projected expense for the society. That is in line with best practice across the board in the US and elsewhere. I tend to have a bias toward the 12 months, but I am comfortable with that fluctuation if necessary. This year was necessary in order for us to fund the endowment. And then I will refer to the endowment now that it's the major part of our focus. So the endowment is the purview of the governing board directly. As Steve said, it cannot be changed. The money will not be withdrawn from it unless there is a directive that takes 3/4 of the voting from the governing board. It is managed by our executive director. I monitor the balances in order to keep the balances alignment with the guidance that we receive from the governing board. So what is the current guidance? Steve mentioned how it got started and what the charter reads, which is a minimum of $8 million. We do have currently, well, as of end of month, last month, end of July, about $9.8 million in the endowment. The governing board, under the current strategic planning that was made available to membership after the meeting last November, has a new minimum target that's $13.6 million, and then we expect to reach that minimum, and that's when another part of the projections and modeling comes under the hood in order for us to get to that amount. So why that amount? That was what the strategic planning committee analyzed and got to as a minimum in order for the society to maintain its operations past 2030 after the contract with the Springer, the current contract at least, expires. If we didn't have any other contract, given all the changes that are happening and we expect to continue to happen in the publishing industry, how we would maintain our mission and have our journals still publishing in whatever format and having our meetings happening. So that's the target for the possibility of the meeting to exist with the lowest possible dues for our membership and meeting registration, despite the fact that we just started charging registration for the meeting still is the lowest, as Steve mentioned, across our sister society. So more about the funds. So nobody worries. The society does not select stocks on which to invest. Since the endowment started, the strategy has been to have active accounts in 2 investment. Well, we started with 3. We have reduced it to 2 after some analysis of the performance of the management companies, the investment management companies. We currently have accounts with Fidelity and Vanguard that are active, and we invest in their funds, and the funds are US stock market based or international stock market based from the US perspective, and US bonds. The society also has money market accounts in those institutions that pay interest in our balances. And at the start of the endowment, we had a simple strategy that allowed the endowment to take hold and to grow. And it was a simple 1/3 times 3, if you will. What am I talking about? The US stock market, the outside the US stock market and US bonds, it's 1/3 of it, the funds. That was a strategy that we started with. Since we have grown and reached the 8 million minimum established by the charter balance, and I got on board, I have suggested that the governing board takes a more conservative approach, because the balance is growing, and any losses in a year that those accounts would generate losses, which does happen, and you have a quick pick of that in a second, then we would be farther protected. And so we are exploring different proportions. That's when I have done a lot of modeling on different proportions, and the board will vote on potentially a new arrangement in meeting in November. But we have moved this year. We were directed to have a 10% savings, so to speak, in money market accounts, as opposed to keeping all 100% in those funds. And so we might be moving more toward a safe haven sort of account. And the reason for that is for the longest time, the wisdom around the financial officers in societies and in investment companies was, well, if you do the split with bonds and market, you'll be safe, because when one goes up, the other one goes down, and so you would be safe. Well, we just experienced a couple of years of all of them going down at the same time, and that's when I suggested to reevaluate the strategy to prevent something like that happening in the future, and having a big hit in the society. At the same time, not being particularly reactive, because then when things go down and if we are super reactive, that's when we absorb most losses, realize most losses. So speaking of realization, what type of return does the society experience? And so I'm sharing a chart that has 2 y-axes, and I'm sure we have seen those before, but it doesn't hurt to guide you through what we are looking at. On the left side of the y-axis, we are looking at end of year balances. And I separated endowment and investments in blue and green there, just so you could have an idea. So the endowment started was approved in 2017. We really started in 2018, and you see that the balances were relatively low. We are still struggling to get to that 8 million, so to speak, and we reached that in 2021, but that was with a persistent course of action to invest any leftover that we might have from an operational year, or from the investment themselves to the endowment. So we have been stable with the endowment since 2020, as you can see in the chart that has much more in the endowment than in the so-called regular investment accounts, right? Remember that it's supposed to maintain that 6 months to 12 months, and that's what you see here. Having a minimum of about $1 million assures us that we have enough money with easy access to cover 6 months worth of expenses. If you include the checking account cushion of 3 months, so we are always operating with about 9 months of cushion, which I think for this society is healthy. And at times we get more than that, but you can see that we have been very diligent at maintaining that balance low in order to grow the endowment. And then you might look at the chart and say, well, but Fabio didn't actually keep growing the endowment, because between the 21 and 22 years, we had a bump there downward. And that's when the right y-axis will come in handy, because that's the gain and losses that both unrealized or realized combined, the society has incurred. So 2022 was a bad year for all of the markets, including the bond market, and there was a big hit, about a million and a half. And then we recovered in 2023 with about 1 million. And so what I have been diligent about doing is doing a time-weighted annual return for the society with the two companies that we hold funds in. And you see that the fluctuation there, and I have two colors as comparisons, the gray and the brown. Those are the Dow Jones index, and then the US bond market index. And so you can see that, yeah, there are years that everybody saw a gain. The gains are not the same, but then 2022, everybody saw a loss. So did our accounts, right? And so I'm trying to get to a proportion, as I had mentioned, that shields us from huge losses, such as that 15 and 16% here, and doesn't hurt too badly when we have gains. And so it's always that balance of how much risk we're going to take to get the reward. So what's the outlook? If I look at it now, and that's what Steve said, that, yeah, he knows that I have done some modeling in getting to 2030. What does it look like? It is solid. So we have the endowment accounts that need to average about 6% in annual returns through the year of 2030 in order for us to get to that minimum target that is 13.6, excuse me. New target that the strategic planning espoused. We do have an upper limit on that as well, and that upper limit is 18.1. The upper limit might be one that we would not reach by 2030. However, that now I think makes it clear why we are introducing meeting registrations other than those super large increases in expenses, but also in order for us to be able to have an additional contribution at times, because that annual meeting cost will fluctuate. There will be years that will be able to have an additional annual contribution to the endowment. There will be years that we won't have that ability. But that's fine as long as we have that. If we had additional contributions of $200,000 per year and a higher average rate of return to 7.5 as opposed to 6 that I use conservatively, then we would actually reach that upper limit, but not through 2030. We would need an extra year to get there. But given that we want to be in that range by the end of 2030, and then they start 2031, my projections show a solid foundation. Of course, my disclaimer will be, well, all of the analysis that I have done with past history is no guarantee of future performance. That said, I expect us to be able to reach our goals and maintain the function of the society no matter what future board, when the negotiation of the renewal or not of that contract lends us. If we still have a publishing contract, then we'll be in super positive situation. If it doesn't, we will still have the ability to use interest from all of those accounts, of course, by then at a different proportion across the different types of investments in order for us to be able to maintain the society functioning as we want it to function. So stop sharing here and send it back to Steve and then see if Tyler has any questions for us.
Okay, thanks so much, Fabio. I think that was, yeah, very informative. Now, Tyler, do you want to take over the moderation?
For sure. Yeah, it looks like we had two questions come in the chat. Would you like me to read those off?
Sure.
Okay, so from Justin, we have, from what I see, PS is managing investments and determining asset allocation on their own. At this level endowment, what I usually see is that this is turned over to a professional investment management firm. If PS is not doing this, why not?
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question. We do have an answer to that. Fabio, do you want to go first on that, or should I?
Sure. Yes, the strategic planning, when recommending that range of 13.6 to $18.1 million, also recommended that the governing board explore that. The governing board discussions have been around what are the pros and cons, and then deciding when we would start doing that. I favor, for example, this is my personal recommendation, not the governing board's view. I favor having someone look at our strategies, but not hire someone who will try to dictate our strategies. In other words, an assessment of the strategy, and then make recommendations or even a grade. Is it bad? Good, middle, and then allowing us to change that, not to be caught up with an investment professional investment management company that will try to get fees that will then cut our ability to get to that annual return that we have been experiencing this way.
Yeah, and thank you. And I want to add some history to that, which is that, the society has frequently been confronted with that question. And there was one time not too long ago when we did seek external investment advice. This was right before the GFC, the financial crisis. And the advice we were given was to invest in, what are they called? Collateralized debt obligations, now known as complete junk. And had we done that, had we followed that advice, the society would be basically bankrupt. So, our investment strategy is conservative, but it is broad and it is safe, I think. And we have therefore repeatedly decided not to reach out and hand this over to some people who are trying to make money out of it. And Lou, I'm sure you've got a lot extra to say to that.
Hi, everybody. This is going great. Actually, I'm just seeing if Fabio can describe a little bit more of what we with working with Jim Pomerantz while he was our finance committee chair, where we kind of went through a Darwinian approach by comparing our investment advisors' performance over this process of working with index funds over a 4-year period. And Fabio, can you just briefly, because you're the one that did the majority of that review during that time.
Sure, yeah, without mentioning names, but yeah, so when we looked at the performance of the 3 accounts, you may recall that I mentioned that in the beginning we did have 3 accounts. The 3rd account was the one that was actively managed by a professional, and it was the one that returned the least to the society, and had a hefty fee for us to maintain that, and we didn't get nearly the same positive returns in the years that were positive, and even worse in the years that were negative. That was the account that lost most money.
And then the second question, shall we just continue with that also from Justin? Tyler, do you want to read it out?
Yeah, for sure. So the second question from Justin is, as I understand from the presentation, the cost of running the conference have gone up considerably. For example, AV and hospitality. Has there been consideration given to choosing locations in lower cost areas? The last two conferences are in New York City and San Francisco, some of the highest cost cities in the country.
Yeah, again, good question, and we have considered that. There's a couple of problems that stand in the way. The first one is simple logistics. There aren't that many hotels in North America that can accommodate us. We're big, and so there's a lot of cities that are just not suitable because there's no venue that could accommodate us in the traditional way. So that's one option. The other option is that, one consideration. The other consideration is that actually, we got an incredibly good deal for New York City this year, and it's the biggest conference we've ever had because it is, yes, expensive, but also extremely attractive. And Lou, I'm sure, again, do you want to add something to that? That was just a thumbnail sketch, but I think
Sure, absolutely. The AV costs are up across the board. It doesn't necessarily matter what city it is. We're going to have same kind of costs to the society in Denver. Now, food and beverage will be a little bit less. There won't be the union fees as well. But cities like San Francisco and New York do draw large attendance because of the cities themselves. We have a lot of non-North American attendees, over 30% that are coming. And no offense to people in smaller level cities, but Charlotte, North Carolina, for example, may not have the drive for people or the appeal for a meeting, though the costs could be less. And so we do take that into account. Of course, we also have what space is available. We book 6 and 7 years out because of the size of the organization. And we have to be careful. If we keep growing, we will outgrow even these large, what we call single box hotels, and potentially having to go to convention centers, which we all know feels rather impersonal. So this is a balance. We do think, in fact, the board just discussed this at our summer board meeting, that we may need to rotate to smaller cities from time to time to help manage the costs overall, but also to check it out and see how attendance is and whether our European members may not decide to attend a meeting in Cleveland as an example. So there's a lot of things that we look into taking this. My experience doing this here and at APS, I worked there for 10 years, is that the large cities bring large attendance and sometimes large expenses. But I think the expenses of food and beverage and AV are just going to be the same across all of the cities going forward. Now, individually, we do our best to try to keep your room rates as low as possible. That's why our negotiation of adding 4,000 room nights, for example, in New York City, has a bit of effect for that. And we want to make sure we call it lift in the business, but that's flowing from one airport to another without having too many legs, changeovers, especially for our European and our Asian members as well. So there's a lot of things that we consider going through there, but good questions. And I hope that answered a lot of it for you.
thanks.
Thank you.
And Tyler, over to you again.
Yep. Yeah, we have a few more questions. So this next one is from Jennifer. Can you talk more about the modeling forecasting that the society is doing to anticipate loss of royalty income with changes to the publishing industry?
Yeah, Fábio, I think that's yours, isn't it?
Sure. So the contract runs through 2030 that we have with Springer. So barring an attempt to rescind the contract. The projection has been the worst case scenario after 2030 is we will have no high source of income. With the only source of income would come from membership dues and registration. Can we? So the question, Jennifer, would be, can we run the society past that in that worst case scenario? And this one, the strategic strategic planning committee also took a look at that. The answer was, if we have enough in the endowment, we would be able to sustain that until we figured out another source of income. But as Steve said, but even considering if we get to that range and ever lower from that range, we would be able to keep running the society. But then, of course, barring unexpected doubling of AV costs and other costs, for example, right, in the future, but within reasonable estimates of what we believe to be reasonable estimates of what the cost would be to run the annual meetings, we'd still be able to run past 2030 with the current strategy, reaching that range of the endowment funds.
Okay, Tyler, do you want
Thank
to
you. Yep.
give us the next question?
Yep. The next one is, can you talk more about the various fee structures the society considered when determining membership and conference fees? For example, student, postdoc, ECR, regular, emeritus, low income, country of origin, etc.
Yeah, well, I can certainly speak to that. I mean, we put a lot of thought and effort and consideration into this. We considered 5 or 6 different models of costs, both for membership and registration. And we settled on what we did now as a board by weighing all these considerations about, equity, diversity, trying to make sure people, students can afford it, et cetera, et cetera. So whatever, yeah, I mean, of course, other people may have come to different answers, but we certainly spent a lot of time discussing that and looking at the fee structure and make it as fair and palatable as possible. I don't know, Lou or Fabio, do you want to add anything to that? Because I don't recall what other models I just know there was a help. We spent a lot of time on it.
I know. I would just add, no, I don't think we need to go over all the other possible models, but one thing that I would add is that the board, me, Lou, we looked at over 6 other different societies, and one premise that we didn't waver from was whatever value in the free structure we adopt, we want to be the lowest in the field. And so we compared ourselves, and I presented to the board, then if we match the lowest and all the way to, okay, if we are not matching the lowest, but we still are, say, halfway through, 10% through, 20% through, and that's how we actually started evaluating all the models. That's how I started evaluating or putting the parameters into the model was, we won't surpass the lowest. And then let's go from there and see how much difference it will make in terms of all of the strategic planning that we are speaking about.
And I'd like to add also that the board created a new award for students from developing nations, trying to show that while there are fees associated with attending the meeting, we're trying to do our best to try to help accommodate, albeit a small group, but within what our budget can handle, we are doing our best to try to help people from these emerging developing nation places. We also have we have 25 slots which you all will be seeing in September, for student volunteers to help out at the meeting, where we get $100 on site. We give them a credit card, Visa, MasterCard gift card, I guess it is really, so that they, if they volunteer for 3 hours of work helping to direct, you've probably seen them at the meetings over the years. So we are trying to look at ways to help mitigate the costs associated with attending the meeting also.
Okay, thank you. Now, are there any further questions? I can't see anything in the chat. But if somebody wants to raise their hand, we can also give you the floor now that we dealt with the first set. Any further questions or suggestions, comments, concerns? We will be making the recording available to others who couldn't make it today. But, yep. Yeah, what we're going to do, we'll announce this in the next Psychonomic Scientist, I think. We're not going to make it totally public since it's a members-only forum, but anybody who's a member can ask for the link and the password of the recording for today. Well, if there are no other questions, then all that's left for me to do is to thank you all for coming and to thank you for asking those questions. I think they're very good questions. And we will continue to take questions from the membership, of course, and suggestions about how to do this, because I think it's extremely important to be transparent about this. It's your society, and we try to do our best to manage it on your behalf. And yes, let me add to what Lou is saying. I hope I'm going to see you all in person in New York City. The vibes are really good, and I'm very much looking forward to that. So thanks for coming, and take care.